When one looks at the classics of the GameCube, you might be hard-pressed to find a list without Factor 5's magnum opus and sequel to their stellar Rogue Squadron, Rogue Leader. And indeed, the title paved the way for the GameCube. Despite releasing within months of its system, few titles within the system's shelf life could graphically compete, and that's to say nothing of the outstanding audio compression which everyone back in the day was taking notes on. For all that, however, there is the eternal question: does the gameplay hold up? And that is a little more difficult to judge. Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader is a natural progression from Rogue Squadron and, to an extent, Battle for Naboo. It takes much of what works and tried to refine it, quite successfully for the most part, whilst eliminating much of what did not work, namely anything to do with ground combat. To that end, Rogue Leader pushed the boundary for what the series could allow within the mechanics it utilized, both for good and for bad. The good being, this is a generally enjoyable game. The bad being, it's clear this was the extent of the developer's skill in game design, as the following game in the series would attest. But that's a different video. Rogue Leader is an arcade-styled flight combat game closely following the major battles of the original trilogy, which an astute observer might quickly note, wasn't Luke only a participant for the major battles up into Hoth? Why yes, and that's why the majority of the title has the player controlling the indomitable ace Wedge Antilles, who you might recognize as the only character to survive 2 Death Star attack runs, reprised in all his glory by the great Dennis Lawson. The story loosely follows Rogue Squadron, from its inception amid the survivors of Red up through the Battle of Endor. But there's not much of an overarching tale to be told here, nor do any of the characters truly exist within the game beyond those instantly recognizable. There's so few that when Wedge takes over early in the game, his wingmen go unnamed and uncharacterized for the remainder. Instead, we're given missions which are tangentially related to the 3 major battles depicted within the game: the Battle over Yavin, the Battle of Hoth, and the Battle of Endor. Which does unfortunately mean the game is on the shorter side, consisting of a mere 10 missions, plus a handful of secret missions of varying quality and length. On top of that, a significant portion of those first 3 missions are spent in something of a tutorial, with the game often more interested in featuring, often unskippable, cutscenes rather than gameplay, and, especially in that first iconic level, featuring so little difficulty that's rather boring to replay. Which, to be fair, is something of an issue shared with the original, but the original also featured quite a few more levels. Fortunately, things pick up quickly in the mid-game with one of the highlights to the title, a fight against one of the famed and deadly Star Destroyers in a vicious 2-part battle, and the rest of the game tends to ride this high all the way to the end. Still, this lack of levels tends to have consequences beyond game length. For example, there are only 4 real ground-based levels, meaning many of the most iconic vehicles in the series are barely featured. The memorable AT-ST, for example, is only featured in a single level. The other side of this coin is Factor 5 finally figuring out how to implement space battles. While Battle for Naboo suffered due to a lack of background landmarks and poor view distance, Rogue Leader has 0 issues with view distance, and always keeps landmarks around you to make referencing your position against the mission area an afterthought, to the point where the space missions are the highlights to the game. Similarly, enemy AI has been beefed up considerably, and is easily the best Factor 5 came up with. While ground vehicles and turrets remain relatively simple, though I will mention appreciation that they strike a good balance for challenging the player with their accuracy just enough to keep them on their toes without being aggravating, the TIE fighters have really been beefed up to be more fun to fight against. Although there are many different levels of skill involved in enemy AI which can be most easily seen in an endurance mode I'll get back to, TIEs tend to fall under one of 2 categories. The first is the brainless flocks, similar to those seen in the original title. These will be a small squad of enemies which follow a set pattern in the world, firing as they come across opponents. That is, until you take out their leader, after which they'll become evasive, spread apart and reform around a new leader to continue along their scripted path. The second are your dogfighters. These are the more deadly opponents who will follow you and attempt to engage. Unlike Rogue Squadron, however, they do not turn on a dime to keep you constantly within their crosshairs, but have more controlled turns which become tighter the better the AI becomes. It's a rather impressive improvement, which is still far from perfect. See, while these limitations improve the AI tremendously, they still are unable to actively switch targets, gauge threats, or perform maneuvers far beyond the quick evasive move they use to break formation and turning to meet you. Enemies either spawn along their normal pathing or they engage you. There's no in between, there's no adjustment or switching things up. They won't become distracted by your wingmen or pull off engaging a target to focus suddenly on you. It's all very rudimentary. What's more, AI does not recognize spacing or collisions whatsoever. One of the easiest ways to get rid of ties, in fact, is getting them to ram into each other. Similarly, I found the deadliest thing in the game by far to be making sweeping turns when enemies are tracking me, as a lone kamikaze T-bones my X-Wing and probably the most aggravating mechanic in the game. Almost as aggravating, especially upon replay, is how few enemies there are to face. Not so much in raw numbers, which is indeed impressive especially for the time, but in variety. Rogue Leader offers mostly the same exact enemies you faced off against in Rogue Squadron. The only difference is the thankful removal of the annoying missile turrets and the outstanding addition of the Star Destroyer. Outside of that, all the opponents you face will be exactly the same. You'll even fight them exactly the same. A bit annoyingly, and it's around this title which I began finding the need for speeders to wrap up AT-ATs growing long in tooth. That said, the game truly isn't long enough for this to become too major a complaint, and the variety which is present lasts just long enough to allow the available levels to be interesting. But all this time spent talking about the enemies and levels, and I've barely touched on the starfighters you're allowed to control. Rogue Leader features a stable of classics which attempted to put their best foot forward, though some certainly turned out far better than others. Your standard X-Wing is the game's bread and butter. Everything one could desire from the game's iconic centerpiece, with a balanced speed, maneuverability, shields, and a deadly set of blasters. The A-Wing provides all the speed and agility you'd want, but at the cost of shields, while the Y-Wing stands at stark contrast, probably never being used by any player outside of missions which are strictly required for bombing runs. The Speeder, meanwhile, offers a balanced spread of features, basically being an X-Wing meant for AT-AT-based missions. The newly introduced B-Wing is something of a mobile missile platform, something between an X-Wing and a Y-Wing, though lacking one key trait. From there we have our specials. The Naboo Starfighter makes its return as something of a cross between the X-Wing and an A-Wing for what is probably the strongest craft in the game. The Millennium Falcon, however, proves a disappointing downgrade, being slow, unwieldy, and the auto-tracking on its guns being useless against anything not coming at you in a straight line. For as poor as it is, though, the Slave 1 takes a cake of useless ships, being as slow as a Y-Wing, with shields of an A-Wing, and a ship so horrible I honestly wonder why it was included. Fortunately, there's the TIE Advance, made popular by Darth Vader, which is kind of like if you took a TIE fighter, gave it X-Wing shields, and threw on cluster missiles. Insanely dangerous. Finally are the odds and ends you may find in missions, the TIE Fighter, Imperial Shuttle, and Cloud Car, which are each appropriately weak but can be found and taken on certain missions if you are daring enough. Each of these are unlocked by completing the game, earning medals with good performance, and completing certain challenges, and can be decked out with found upgrades hidden throughout the campaign, such as improved blasters, shields, and secondary weapons. Overall, the game provides a pretty good spread of ships which, when including the upgrades found in levels, can offer a good bit of variety to whatever suits your taste. Except for one detail. See, Rogue Leader, like its predecessor, offered an antiquated arcade-style take on gameplay in which not only did you have a certain number of lives per mission, but seems to expect the player to die fairly frequently. As such, most of these ships have a relatively low payload, with the only way to replenish being death. Most also lack shield regeneration, courtesy an R2 or R5 unit, making surviving some of the longer and more grueling levels a chore at best. Only the X-Wing, Y-Wing, and Naboo Starfighter regenerate shields, making them the only truly viable craft for longer missions, and most notably the Endurance mission, and not even the Y-Wing in that case. This disconnect in viability really makes the ships feel limiting, and levels which don't feature them or are catered to them are less fun because of this. In other words, due to the mechanics of the game, the early game is far too easy and holds the player's hand too much, and most of the rest suffers from either being too short to necessitate using ships without regenerating shields, or too long to utilize anything but the X-Wing, or the Naboo Starfighter if you've unlocked it, all whilst featuring very few enemy types. The result is a game which, while certainly fun, doesn't quite offer the variety one might hope for, especially in the ship department. I'll also mention here the removal of blaster linking. While still somewhat present in your initial shot after a brief charge, the game has removed from the original your ability to manually link your weapons, something which might be more disappointing except for lack of viable targets this might be useful against, with most of the game focused far more on dogfighting. To help make up for this, the game now features a light auto-targeting feature which helps make dogfighting far more viable for ships that don't start with the letter X. Unfortunately, this auto-targeting is a slight over-tweaked and tends to aim for flock leaders over whatever is centered on your crosshairs, which can cause all new issues with aiming. The game does feature solid bonus content in the form of its phenomenal music track, a couple bonus missions, and an ace mode, but the latter two are hardly anything I'd write home about. The bonus missions feature a turret shooter with, frankly, awful controls. By design, it appears. Featuring no reticle and targeting which links directly to the joystick means you're constantly fighting against your aim. The two flight levels are considerably better, including the Empire's response to Yavin, though the other is a less than stellar rendition of the supposedly exciting asteroid chase sequence, which isn't very exciting. Then there's Endurance mode, which is a good idea on paper, but due to the nature of being Endurance means, again, you're realistically limited to just the X-Wing and Naboo Starfighter. It also features a distinct lack of enemy variety. You'll nearly exclusively be facing TIE fighters and interceptors. That's it. No bombers, no ground units, no Star Destroyers, nothing. Just your basic TIEs in a broad, bland level interrupted every 10 levels with a couple troop carriers. A lot of basic TIEs. Like 3 hours of basic TIEs. Meaning the Endurance mode drags on longer than that of the entire main campaign plus all other bonus missions. Good idea, horribly executed. Ace mode provides a better variety with improved difficulty, but all this amounts to is enemies shooting faster, which kinda breaks a couple levels and isn't really fun when the majority of the game the danger is that enemies ramming you or killing allies, meaning it basically makes the game an escort mission. Yeah, not great. On a more unusual side, the game does feature an interesting concept of tying certain levels into the time of day you play the game, which is a neat concept which really showed off some of the beauty the engine could provide, but didn't really amount to much good. Like, instead of allowing you to choose the time of day you wish to play, you would have to change the time on your system or wait. This was pretty badly abused by the developers. For instance, to unlock the Naboo Starfighter, you need to play the tutorial level at each time of day. The tutorial is 20 plus minutes long. There are 4 times of day for the tutorial. Meaning, to unlock one of the ships, you needed to run through the entirety of a lengthy tutorial over and over and over again. In another case, your mission parameters and ship type changes based off the time of day, which is neat, but would serve much better on a level select menu, especially as one of these levels is much better than the other. In the end, the game is good fun and is still beautiful to look at and listen to. Mechanically, it offers a simple, enjoyable fun, but it's very obvious the developers reached the limits to many of their capabilities, and many of these mechanics don't hold up all that well today. The game is great for a playthrough, but digging deeper or trying to 100% everything begins to reveal the seams in a nasty way. If you're a fan of Star Wars and arcade-style flight games, I'd call this a must-play. It doesn't offer the complexity, variety, or length of competitors, but it's a juicy snack for fans of the genre.